Hello and welcome to today's webinar, which is entitled Learning Together, Progressive Decriminalisation in Scotland, Ireland, Norway, Poland and Maine, USA. So this is a webinar that is being run as a partnership between Scottish Drugs Forum and the Ana Liffey Drugs Project. I'm Tony Duffin, I'm the CEO of Ana Liffey Drugs Project, and I'll be chairing the first part of this webinar that will run no later than 2:30 p.m. our time. My colleague Dave Little from Scottish Drugs Forum will chair the second part of the webinar, which consists of a panel discussion. I'll tell you a bit more about that in a moment. There has been substantial progress in the discussion and implementation of decriminalisation of drugs in the past 10 years. The issue is more broadly discussed and is more central to wider discourse around drug use and drug harms. Despite this progress, there remain barriers to ending criminalisation and preventing the consequent harms for people who use drugs and wider society. Scottish Drugs Forum are hosting this webinar to coincide with the publication of a new report working to decriminalise people who use drugs, learning from decriminalisation efforts in 5 international jurisdictions. This report has been prepared for Ana Liffey Drugs Project by Scottish Drugs Forum with the support and funding of the Open Society Foundation. The report evaluates the recent decriminalisation and advocacy efforts in Scotland, Poland, Norway, Ireland and Maine. These jurisdictions were selected as they had hosted decriminalisation advocacy projects funded by Open Society Foundation. This webinar will cover the international policy context of decriminalisation and the findings from the report. In a moment, I'll just give you a little rundown of what's involved in the webinar. In a moment, I'll be passing over to Matt Wilson of the Open Society Foundation to launch the evaluation report on the 5 international jurisdictions in terms of decrim advocacy. After that, we will have presentations. One will be from Brendan Hughes, who's with the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction. And Brendan will be looking at international policy background in terms of decrim. And after that, we'll have Katy MacLeod from Scottish Drugs Forum. And Katy will be giving us an overview of the decrim report and recommendations that I've mentioned. So these presentations will be followed by a panel discussion. Panelists will share the learnings from good practice examples from their jurisdictions. There will be an extended discussion of the challenges and learning from implementing these changes. I'll let them, there'll be time for people to introduce themselves, but suffice to say that we have panelists from Norway, from Ireland, from Poland, from Scotland, and from the USA, all experts in their areas. So participants are welcome and indeed encouraged to ask questions at any time. You can submit questions throughout the webinar through the Q&A tab on your toolbar. We will attempt to bring questions into panel discussion towards the end of the webinar. Katy MacLeod from Scottish Drugs Forum will be monitoring questions as they come in, and she will join the panel discussion and summarise the questions being asked. So now I'd like to ask Matt Wilson from the Open Society Foundation to join me. There's Matt, to say a few words and launch the report. I'll just put myself on mute for a second, Matt.
Hi, Tony, and thanks so much. My name is Matt Wilson. I am a division director in the Global Drugs Program at the Open Society Foundations. It is my honor to open this panel discussion, and I am grateful to the Ana Liffey Drugs Project and Scottish Drugs Forum for this opportunity. They've been fabulous allies in advancing the drug policy debate and have produced this excellent report, working to decriminalize people who use drugs, learning from decriminalisation efforts in 5 international jurisdictions. Statements like, "We can't arrest our way out of the drug problem," are almost trite at this point. There's a significant expert consensus that drug use should be an issue of public health, not criminal policy. The new report notes a progression of international documents that move away from criminal enforcement, including the 2018 UN Common Position on Drugs, which endorses decriminalisation. Other policy examples abound. Just recently, the American Society of Addiction Medicines, a historically cautious voice in drug policy reform discussions, recently made a full-throated endorsement of decriminalization, saying, quote, policymakers should eliminate criminal and onerous civil penalties for drug possession and use. This was their first recommendation. Even our artificial intelligence overlords seem rather enlightened on the issue. I recently asked ChatGPT, what should drug policy look like in the future? Its first recommendation, number 1, decriminalization of drug possession. Rather than punishing people who use drugs, a future drug policy should focus on providing them with access to health services and treatment. This can help to reduce the harms associated with drug use and minimize the negative consequences of criminalization. Why then, so many years after Portugal, is it still so hard to advance decriminalization? Why do we live in a world where punitive criminal enforcement or onerous civil penalties remain the norm rather than the exception? The politics of drugs have never been easy, least of all for the politicians that must turn the ship from its present course. Doing nothing or little is often far more expedient. Those of us that want to see change must build power to change the political calculus. And building power is no easy exercise, particularly when we must overcome the weight of stigma, prejudice, and ignorance. The 5 jurisdictions in this report, Ireland, Scotland, Norway, Poland, and Maine, are decriminalization projects that the Open Society Foundations was proud to support, but overall, their projects left unfinished. Politics altered and progress made, but not fully reformed. The insights in this report are important precisely because they emerge from the messy middle and the partial success. The report relays concrete lessons, trials, and errors that should be required reading for anyone thinking about building a decriminalization campaign in their own community. It is an honor to be able to support the passionate advocates who are at the front lines of these campaigns, and I'm grateful that their lessons are cataloged in such a comprehensive report. And so again, congratulations to Ana Liffey and the Scottish Drugs Forum for the wonderful report. And Tony, back over to you.
Thanks very much, Matt. That's great. Thank you. And thanks for your support over the years with regards to supporting the various efforts in the various jurisdictions. So thanks very much to you and your colleagues. So now what we're going to move on to is a couple of presentations. And the first one, I'll invite Brendan Hughes to join me on screen. If you could turn on your camera now, Brendan. Hi, Brendan. And Brendan, I'm going to pass over to you. And Brendan's from the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction, and he's going to give us an overview of policy background. So I'll pass on to you. I'll switch off my camera now, Brendan.
So thank you for the invitation. I was asked just to give a quick 10-minute overview on key definitions. I've worked for over 20 years now looking at the different drug laws, originally in the European countries, and now we're looking further afield with all of cannabis legalization and the different countries that EMCDA works with around Europe as well. And I've learned that it's not just a question of how many years in prison, but more and more it's about definitions, that people are using the same words and meaning different things. So I've developed a few slides over the years that I'd like to share with you so that at least perhaps whenever you discuss, you're using a common language. And I think ultimately you want to know where you're heading rather than trying to discuss a particular label which may or may not fit what you want or what the other person in the discussion wants. So to start off with, a few legal terms applied to drug control. We developed this, I live in Portugal, and for 5 or 6 or 7 years, I got quite tired of hearing that Portugal had legalized all drugs. So we tried to develop a common terminology. Start with decriminalisation. Let's just call it reducing the size of the penalty. And by size, I don't mean the amount of money you pay as a fine or the number of years in prison, but more the overall significance to the offender. And it should become a little bit more clear why I don't come with a more concrete definition than that. But decriminalisation is reducing the significance, the overall weight of the penalty, as opposed to depenalisation, which we use to say removing the application of the penalty. Very, very briefly, decriminalisation may be taking something from a crime down to the level of a civil offence like a parking ticket, while depenalisation may keep something as a crime, but there will be something written in the law which says, well, actually, if the offence is considered minor, you don't have to apply the punishment. So two different things. Diversion, normally someone's dealt with through the justice system, the criminal justice system, and normally that will push someone towards a punitive response. And diversion is the idea of moving away from punitive to a different path, going to a rehabilitative response. And ultimately legalization, which has been mixed up a lot with decriminalisation. I suppose strictly perhaps it's a subset of decriminalisation, but let's try and think of the two different things. A lot of the discussion is legalisation. Now this is actually happening in Europe. Policymakers are more comfortable with the term regulation because it allows that there are several limits still set around, just like with cigarettes, alcohol, etc., which is permitting some form of supply. Doesn't necessarily mean shops. To me, legalization, regulation could mean allowing people to grow their own cannabis plants and use in private. No sales whatsoever. And these have been established in a video which we've had out for, I think, over 10 years now. Just 3 minutes on YouTube, very simple graphic, but I'm told a lot of people really appreciate it. I think we've got that in English and Spanish, just to explain the differences. The video doesn't include diversion, but nevertheless, we try and clarify the differences. So here is going into a bit more detail why I don't give you more explanation about what is decriminalised, because in my experience around Europe, there's different understandings from different people. Someone might say, yes, well, it's not in the criminal code anymore. Well, unfortunately, several countries don't have a criminal code, so that doesn't work everywhere. Other people will say, yes, but it's not judged by a court anymore. It's judged by a local tribunal, a municipal body, a police chief, etc. Other people might say, well, finally, there's no prison possible for this offence, therefore it's decriminalised. But we know, for example, in Ireland, as I remember correctly, there's the first and second offences of cannabis are still considered criminal offences, even if there's no prison available. And finally, this idea of the criminal record, which would seem lovely and simple until you try and discuss with 28 European countries, and then you find out that there's not a common agreement on what is this lovely criminal record that us Anglophones like to discuss. And ultimately, when I hear the discussion of decriminalisation, whether by civil society, by politicians, whatever, I wonder, is it a statement of law or is it a statement of political intentions? Because I've had discussions with experts in their own country, top criminal professors, ministers of justice, etc., where they will disagree with each other about whether a drugs offence has been decriminalised in their country or not. And that's how difficult it is. And this is why EMCDA will not be releasing a map that everybody wants about where is decriminalisation, because there is no agreement on what it is. And ultimately, I see that somebody else mentioned this in the final report as well. I wonder, how useful is the word really? Because it becomes a it becomes a trigger point. Everybody has an opinion on decriminalisation, even if they don't know what it means, or even if they have different opinions on what it means. So perhaps the word is now becoming a little bit either obsolete or at least counterproductive in political discussions. Why change a policy? I think this is more the question that really should be discussed. What is it you actually want? Stay away from the labels and consider really, what is the objective? This is any project planning. What is the objective? What are you trying to achieve? And it's interesting when you look at the changes around Europe. Why have countries reduced their penalties? Is it to encourage drug users to treatment like it was in Portugal? Or is it that they're not interested in the drug users? Is it to save law enforcement resources like it was in Belgium and the UK, I think, for their cannabis reclassifications? Is it for non-drug related reasons? Slovenia decided that it was just a waste of time to have any prison sentence under 1 month. Deleted all those offences. One of them was a personal drugs possession offence. Nothing to do with drugs. It was a criminal policy decision. Even in some cases to save resources on prison supply offences. Those are usually the larger ones. In the big recession 10 years ago, there was a few countries cut their maximum prison sentences for trafficking because it was costing them a fortune. And there are also reasons to increase penalties. Usually we hear about it to send a message, but also there are very detailed reasons to give law enforcement more powers. When an offence has a certain level of penalty, law enforcement have certain powers. And so some countries have chosen to increase those offences in theory. They don't expect someone to get a bigger punishment, but it allows law enforcement to use certain extra powers, longer periods of detention, etc. Those are the decriminalisation discussions. Then we have the legalisation, regulation discussions. And again, why do countries want to do it? Quite different reasons, actually. And we're seeing this through Europe as well, but especially when comparing Europe with North America. So yes, they end up in the same place, but they're doing it with very different intentions. And also be aware, because this is a political discussion, why not? There are reasons not to do it, or at least proposed reasons not to do it. And we have to pay attention to those as well. Most important thing is ultimately, if somebody's going to come and ask, so did it work? My question in response is usually, well, what was it supposed to do? Because many forget this. They are designed for a certain objective, and you need to check to see whether they achieved that objective. And also, of course, any intended or unintended effects. But the discussion about did it work? Well, maybe, depending on what you actually wanted to do. Another issue I'd like to discuss is this expression alternatives to prison, which I was fighting with for 10 years. I think it's changing, but it still exists because there we can consider that we talk about, in criminal justice, we'll normally talk about either retributive measures or rehabilitative measures, two general groups. Retributive might look like these, rehabilitative, these from the UN conventions, education, treatment, rehabilitation, and they may come with prison or they may come without prison. The point is, when you use the expression alternatives to prison, less popular in Europe now, but still very popular in the Americas, you're discussing where this measure takes place. It's the location. And the expression alternatives to prison can encompass both of these groups, which is once again where the confusion comes in. Whereas if you use the expression alternatives to punishment, or now in Europe, politically it's considered alternatives to coercive sanctions, it's more discussing why something is taking place. And that becomes more clear, that it's only talking about rehabilitative measures. What might a country consider? Sometimes I've seen a lot of the time where they say, oh, we should go a bit over to the punitive side. No, we should come back. We should go a bit more to the rehabilitative side. Well, my point here is, in fact, you can have both. And where I'm sitting, Portugal has both. It does have the punitive side. It still gives fines to drug users, and it has the rehabilitative side. You could even plot something here which says only criminal and mainly rehabilitative. And that's as, I think it was Greece, well, 20 years ago, where, or other countries where they'll send persistent drug using offenders who've committed crimes, they'll send them to prison, but basically force them to take treatment in prison. And that's their idea of giving both. I won't go into whether that's a good idea or not, but I'm saying it's not just the question of a simple, where do you put the fulcrum? Where is it? Is it on the rehabilitative side or is it on the criminal side? No, you can have both. You can mix and match several ways, several times. And finally, policy models. And here we're only talking about cannabis. I know there are discussions now, for example, about psychedelics and a few others. So I have this video where on the red side, various terms are describing prohibited behavior, and on the green side, they're describing permitted behavior. And what I see again is that there are components. It's not, I don't call these policies, separate policies. I call them components which can be mixed and put around, and they often are. So you can have the criminal penalties, you can have the non-criminal penalties, or on the legalization regulation side, they might have homegrown use, non-profit closed clubs, sales managed by state shops, or commercial sales. Those very simply, plenty of fine-tuning and fine adjustments with different systems there, but there are different components. And again, not the only ones. I have a suspicion that Uruguay has nearly all of those, possibly not commercial sales, but it has home grow, it has closed clubs, it has state sales, and there will be criminal and non-criminal penalties for those people who don't follow the regulatory limitations. So don't think in terms of one or the other, think in terms of combinations. And basically, several components are possible in one policy. It's not, as I said, it's not just one or the other. Thank you for listening. I didn't time myself. I hope that didn't take up too much time. But my point there is more, what do you want to actually go for rather than trying to fit it in an established label, decriminalisation, alternatives to prison, something else, which other people don't necessarily understand, or they understand in a different way. Try and say what you do want. And I believe this has been mentioned in the report when I scanned through it this morning, that it's much more looking forward to what the things you actually want to happen, rather than trying to put it under a label which people don't always understand the same way you do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brendan. Thank you for a very, very enjoyable and insightful presentation. I'm sure the people joining us here today will be very interested in these notions of looking at things in several ways at the same time and having different policy responses to different situations. So thanks very much. I'll ask you to switch off your camera now. Thanks, because we're going to head over to Katy MacLeod. I'll ask Katy to come in. Hi, Katy. And just before you start, Katy, I just want to thank you for all the work we've done together on the report, which you're about to give some insights on. But I'm aware of the time, so I will stop and I'll let you get on. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much, and thanks for that really concise introduction as well to some of the challenges about defining decriminalisation, because that absolutely came up in the report as well. So I'm going to just head quickly into the findings and really just to give a bit of background. So it covered the 5 jurisdictions: Scotland, Poland, Norway, Ireland and Maine in the USA as well. And the aims really were to look at the situation in each jurisdiction, talk about the emerging themes and the key lessons learned, and then think about some recommendations from that as well. Oh, sorry. And really just to say it is a big report, so please, I think we have sent that already out to all the delegates today, so please do take the time to have a look over, and if people have questions, I'll put my contact details up at the end if people want a bit more information. Just to give you a super quick summary of our methodology, so we did do a review of relevant literature, both that was recommended to us from the international and each jurisdiction experts, and also just relevant international literature as well. And we conducted a media analysis in the 5 jurisdictions and looked at a range of print, digital and social media platforms, so using different software for that, and then conducted 25 qualitative interviews with experts from each of the jurisdictions, and it did include some international experts as well. And then basically brought all that data together and analysed it to produce key themes, so both at international level, but also at the individual jurisdiction level as well. So I'm going to just crack into the findings. So just looking at the factors that influence and progress towards decriminalisation. So participants within the study said it was really important to think about the wider social and cultural context that this occurred in. So people gave examples of other equality issues that had been relevant. So things like equal marriage progress, stuff around sex work and abortion laws and things like that, and looking at decriminalisation within that sort of wider cultural context. And people also highlighted, societal issues, things like religion and things like that could have an impact on that sort of cultural or social context as well. So these were sort of factors that were seen to influence the progress. I think Brendan sort of touched on the cannabis exceptionalism, and certainly that came up within the interviews. People talked about cannabis being treated really quite differently. And I guess it was, people had different opinions about this, about whether it was important to look at medicinal use as quite a separate issue, or whether in fact the progress within medicinal use of both cannabis, but also looking at the sort of psychedelic movement as well, whether that could actually have some lessons for us in looking at wider decriminalisation as well. So these were some of the themes that came up. There was a key role for the media as well. So there was a sense that it was quite mixed in the different jurisdictions, and the different political perspectives of different media outlets had a big influence in this. But there was sort of a general sense that there was some progression happening within the media over time, so coverage being a little bit more sensitive towards it, and we'll definitely talk about that within the media analysis. But also just thinking about the role of law enforcement as well. So it had an important role within decriminalisation, so not only from their ability to sort of influence policy and also the media indeed, but also having a sort of role in the practical implementation of measures. So that might be supporting diversion measures, so diversion to healthcare, and things like implementation of initiatives such as recorded police warnings as well. And then sort of finally, political leadership was seen as having a key role within the influence on progress as well. So one of the things that really came up is changes in leadership could have a dramatic effect on decriminalisation progress. And I'm sure when we come to sort of talking about Norway, that's a really good example of there being a big change when there was a change in government. So it could range from a complete block on legislation being implemented just to a general loss of support for evidence-based harm reduction measures. So things like support for drug consumption rooms or safer consumption facilities as well. So these were some of the key factors. And then we asked people about effective strategies when advocating for decriminalisation. So advocacy was seen as a key component of this. So it was important to have both high profile and outspoken advocates for decriminalisation, and particularly where they had influential political positions, but also in the sort of wider sector. So for example, within healthcare as well. advocates within the media were also seen as important, and having people with lived and living experience at the core of that. So things like having grassroots organisation involvement and people that basically were directly affected by the harms of criminalisation. So having them as core within those advocacy efforts were seen as effective strategies. And Brendan's touched on this as well around the framing of decriminalisation. So in terms of the wider sort of public understanding of it, it's important to frame the issue carefully to maximise support for this as well. So this might be avoiding using the term decriminalisation itself and just focusing on what would actually happen as a result of the changes rather than focusing on the legislative process. So for example, that could be emphasising that people would be offered health interventions, harm reduction, and there would be access to voluntary treatment instead of punishment. Crucial that we sort of highlight that that's voluntary treatment as well. So certainly people highlighted coercive treatment was certainly not progress as well. So it was really important to make that, to underline that. And finally, incremental change as well. So again, people had different thoughts about this, but generally speaking, the majority of the interviews, people talked about sometimes trying to achieve major or rapid change for drug legislation was pretty challenging, and it may be more feasible to focus on the gradual changes that may hopefully eventually lead to decriminalisation. And those sort of incremental shifts could just support greater acceptability. So, the theory was that if you did a small change and then were able to evaluate it and produce the evidence, that got a lot more public support as well. So some examples that people gave were things like progress through medication-assisted treatment, implementation of drug consumption rooms, depenalisation type measures as well, and all of these things, things like recorded police warnings, things like that, all of these things could be small changes on the road to a wider, what we might refer to as de jure decriminalisation as well. So these were some of the key things. And within the media analysis, we certainly saw that there was very similar themes. Some of the things that really were key were the hierarchy of drugs that was evident within the media. So greater acceptability for certain drugs. So certainly the difference between how cannabis is talked about within the media compared to heroin, that was really noticeable, but also their uses. So again, the form, so whether people inject, for example, again, that might be more heavily stigmatized within media coverage. And then also the hierarchy of people who use drugs. So again, certain groups of people are more likely to be discriminated within that. So, there was key themes of things like poverty, ethnicity, things like that, the difference between young people using and people with more entrenched substance use. So all of that came through within the media and really sort of related to the sort of general stigma and the portrayal within the media. And again, we saw the similar sort of themes around confusion of terminology and decriminalisation being often conflated, decrim and legalisation being conflated. And then certainly in terms of more sympathetic media coverage, the framing within a public health sort of argument that generally was more effective within the media. And then looking at the sort of quality and diversity within that. So, people talked about the sort of balanced coverage, so all of the things that we've talked about, the different media bias that might exist, the misinformation, how medicinal use is covered might well dictate how other forms of drug policy reform is viewed. So all of these things were key when we looked at the sort of wider media analysis as well. And then within media and the police, whether there was a kind of portrayal of criminalisation as a benefit, so talking about the move away from, drugs being part of organised crime, and whether, basically this was helpful to actually think about criminalising possession because it was a way of targeting other forms of like drug supply, for example. So whether that was suggested that was helpful within the media, or whether indeed it was criminalisation was seen as a harm. So you know, certainly in terms of vulnerable groups being criminalised and things like that as well. So again, the media approached this quite differently in terms of police coverage of this issue as well. And then the general political discourse around drug policy as well. So, you know, to give an example of this, in Scotland, for example, you know, the fact that drug policy is reserved for Westminster, and certainly the Scottish Government policy is, the SNP policy is supportive of decriminalisation, and sometimes, you know, was that quite helpful in seeing, you know, the wider drug laws that were imposed not on a national basis, that weren't accepted at a national level, whether those were sort of seen as alien or foreign, old-fashioned ways of thinking. So things like that came through within the media analysis as well. And then media responses to harm reduction, so how they covered things like issues such as safer consumption facilities as well. So again, more sympathetic coverage to harm reduction initiatives, often sort of dictated about their coverage of the wider issues themselves. So that's like a really quick summary of some of the key findings. And then we've just got like a few quotations that I'm going to share just on the screen. So, you know, just kind of, again, this point making that decriminalisation argument needs to be clear. You know, so we really need to be sure what the argument is and how we articulate that as well. And then this quotation from Scotland was just talking about the subtle stigma that can come into the media as well. So even just like use of imagery and things like that. And whilst we might see some progression within media coverage, you can still see extremely stigmatizing terms used that potentially the next week. So just this needs of ongoing sort of education, and you know, every time that you're doing a story about drugs, you know, you don't have to have images that are potentially stigmatizing and things like that as well. So these were kind of things that came up. So from our international perspective as well, you know, like there was again this issue about conflation of legalisation and decriminalisation came up, and whether or not some concerns were around, you know, was it a slippery slope to legalisation if, for example, decriminalisation was considered, and that was a barrier for some policymakers, the general public and things like that. And then again around incremental change, so, you know, kind of a suggestion that being able to make these small changes, take steps, evaluate it, and then if it's successful, then, you know, keep that progress going as well. That's when maybe there's greater public and political acceptability. Okay. And in terms of diversion to treatment, so I sort of alluded to this already, but, you know, really important when we think about diversion and think about the sort of health aspect of that, you know, it has to be non-coercive, you know, and again, you know, thinking about treatment in its widest sense. So, you know, drug-free treatment might be the goal for many, but equally treatment that's a condition is possibly not the direction that people want to go as well. So, you know, thinking about treatment that is voluntary and non-coercive is really key to this as well when we're thinking about diversion models. And within advocacy, and again, when we come to the panel discussion, I'm sure we'll dip into this more, but, you know, just the benefits of bringing people together as well and involving politicians within that as well. So there was a great example within Norway where their campaign talked about, you know, kind of around punishment doing harm. It was really important that politicians actually adopted, you know, this as well. So they were using that terminology, and that really seemed to be an effective message. So these were some other factors. And then finally, just to kind of talk about the power of personal stories. So certainly in particular, you know, and we saw this across different jurisdictions, but Maine had some great examples of it that Courtney, I'm sure, will share later on. but just about the involvement of lived and living experience and the grassroots support, and how important that is to have those people at the heart of the debate. So that might be people in recovery, it might be people who are using drugs, and just ensuring that all those voices are heard, the range of lived and living experience. And so just to finish off with a little bit about the learning and recommendations. So I'm not going to spend too much time on these because we're going to cut to the panel and really hear from the experts. But certainly the kind of key themes that jumped out was, there was definitely a need to look at terminology that was used and think about what is the most effective terminology within your jurisdiction, and then just different levels of things that you can do. So around some of the terminology, there was great examples like within the media, for example. If you ran polls within the media, if you use certain terminology, you might get quite different results. So actually polls that focused on ending the criminalisation of people, that tended to get more positive polling within the general public. And then within education as well, so kind of educating the wide range of stakeholders on what decriminalisation is, what is being proposed at that level. So there was certainly good examples from Poland as one example, where they did training work with prosecutors and judges to really educate them about drugs and the harms of criminalisation and harm reduction strategies as well. And then having a shared understanding and communication as well. So bringing all the different groups together. So within certainly jurisdictions such as Maine, there was bipartisan coalition, so medical professionals, legislators, lived and living experiences, bringing them all together in the room. And certainly there was work very similarly done in Ireland around this as well. And then incremental change. So Scotland was one example of that, seeing like recorded police warnings. So it was extended to include all drugs, including Class A drugs. So previously just for cannabis, but now bringing in all drugs. And then having political advocates on your side. So Ireland did some fantastic work around that. So the Irish Minister for Drug Policy support and work around decriminalisation and working on safer injecting facilities as well. The framing and narrative as well. So again, some great examples from Norway around the Decriminalise campaign. So, kind of bringing in the human stories around decriminalisation was really, really important. And I know we're very grateful to have Peter here today to talk about the activism that can happen at individual level. So the setting up of a overdose prevention centre, an unlicensed overdose prevention centre, and how that can be done at individual level. So it'd be great to hear from him about the challenges and learning from that. And then finally, just how we integrate medicinal use into this as well. So medicinal cannabis use, and so there was great work done in Poland around how to bring some of those movements together and maybe use that to articulate the rationale for drug policy reform overall. And so just to kind of leave you with a quote around it. So, if we really start thinking about, rather than focusing on decriminalisation of drugs, thinking about decriminalisation of people, that seemed to be the thing that all advocates within different jurisdictions agreed on, that was an effective argument for people. So just to thank everyone that was involved in the project. So certainly OSF for funding, Tony and the team at Ana Liffey Drugs Project, the variety of staff that were involved within SDF. So massive thanks to Austin, Sam, Martin and Saul, who were all part of the data collection with myself, and also the project advisory group as well. So both Matt and Neve from Release were also part of that as well. So thanks to them, and I'll pass back to Tony now. Thank you.
So yeah, thank you, Katy. Great timing. And I'm going to pass over to David in one moment. I just want to, from an Irish perspective, my colleague Anna's on the panel in a moment, but I just want to acknowledge the work that's been going on in Ireland. There's a health diversion programme being worked on. There are already alternatives to coercive sanctions, local accords, which I'm sure people will hear more about in the future. And we have a citizens' assembly, which will be starting its work on the 14th of April. So this report that we've just had launched here today is really well timed. And the other things I would just add is good to hear about lived and living experiences of people who use drugs or people who have used drugs, and that communication and messaging, shared messaging is really important. So thank you. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to ask Dave Little to join me, and I'm going to hand over to Dave, who's going to take over the rest of it and chair the panel. So thanks everybody, and over to you, Dave. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony, and thanks for all the support of Ana Liffey on this project. If I could ask all the panelists to join. So what I thought to start with, rather than go through the list of introductions, I'll just ask you in turn to introduce yourselves, and if you could just describe briefly your own work around activism in this area. So I'll just start. Who's the person who's to the right of me on screen, which is Courtney. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, thanks so much. Hi, everybody. My name is Courtney Gary Allen. I use pronouns she, they. I'm the organizing director of the Maine Recovery Advocacy Project, or MRAP for short. We do grassroots organizing and activism with people who use drugs and people who are in recovery. We help to lift the voices of lived experience. Okay.
Do you want to say a little bit more about your role as an activist just now?
Yeah, sure. So around the decriminalization debate here in Maine in the United States, we've been helping to lead the conversation around what criminalization of drugs does to people, especially people who use drugs. In particular, last legislative session, we helped to lead the campaign. It was LD 967, which was a bill that would have created a civil penalty for the possession of substances here in Maine. We helped to lead that campaign all to a historic victory in the House of Representatives as well, and we came super close in the Senate. We only lost by 2 votes. In particular, we were the ones kind of in the legislature helping to lead the grassroots campaign.
Okay, thanks very much, Courtney. We'll come back to you in a minute. Can I ask Magda to go next?
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all participants from different parts of the world that are joining us. Wonderful to be here, and thank you for the invitation. So my name is Magda Domkowska. Since last year, I've coordinated the drug policy work of the Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights, which is one of the oldest and biggest human rights organizations in Poland. It's based in Warsaw, not in Helsinki. So the shortest way to describe my own engagement at the country level would be to say that I'm engaging in advocacy. I spent quite a few years involved mainly in the advocacy at the international level and supporting the national one from the donor's perspective. But as I mentioned, since last year, I'm back to Warsaw and focus mainly on Poland. As Helsinki Foundation, we monitor the situation in the country, the developments or the threats for drug policy. We follow the public debate. We try to involve in it and feed it with the human rights arguments for decriminalization. We are involved in educational activities for different stakeholders. My colleagues from legal units work on concrete court cases, thinking also about the strategic litigation. So there are different types of involvement and engagement, and I'm mostly a talker. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Magda. That's why we have you on the panel. Okay, can I go to Kenneth next?
Thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm happy to be here and to bless this debate with my Norwegian accent, which I'm sure you all have heard a lot lately with the General Secretary of NATO being on all people's screens. My name is Kenneth. I'm a managing director for an NGO called RIO. It's a users association in the field of alcohol and drugs. And our NGO was engaging with the drug policy reform question leading up to the previous health minister, and was also the deputy of the ruling Conservative Party when he took this pro-decriminalization stance and managed to actually convince this party, which was, if it weren't for him, it would not have happened. This is my impression, because he had been engaging with the drug question for a long time and involving civil society and actually been shouted at, quite a lot. But at some point, he just changed his mind and decided to go this way. And following from this, most in Norway, most political parties, they had to make a decision on their national assemblies, because it was such a powerful figure, and also was a health minister and was quite respected as a health minister. So the most parties made a decision. We believed that we actually had a quite clear majority, since also the other state-bearing party, the Social Democrats, said that they were on board, and actually also pushed for the establishment of an expert committee quite quickly. So from March 2018, I was appointed as a member of this public drug policy reform committee. We worked for more than 1 year assessing the question and proposing a model for decriminalization, and we produced a report, which some of you are maybe aware of, but it's not in English anywhere, the whole report on 400 pages. So maybe only the summary is available. In short, the proposal was decriminalization in terms of removing use and possession from the penal code and into civil law. Where the police would still, so it's not liberal. I would say, the police would still be the actor that discover people when they use and possess, but they could not give them any kinds of punishment, but decide that they have to face some municipal counseling service. But we did not propose any sanctions if people did not attend to have this information from the counseling unit, due to there was no research supporting that punishment against use and possession would lead to reduced drug use. So it would be strange to have like a civil sanction to some people at some places, and this would magically give the message so that teenagers don't start using cannabis or whatever mental acrobatics you could find there. I don't know if I should go on with this, but it's been an ongoing debate in Norway. We put forward this model, which was seen as quite liberal by some. The proposal that came from the government was then a watered down model of what we had proposed, but everything that could go wrong, I would say, went wrong. We had COVID. That was one thing. So our big meetings that we were planning, they were stopped. We lost the police, which we were advised, to make sure that you have the police on board. And I think everybody thought that we did. We had a police officer at the reform committee, but then he took out his dissents, a week or something before we delivered it. He gave the data to the director of the police. They went out and started engaging, and that was a huge problem, actually, when they were so massively involved politically. Then also we had the Progress Party, which was part of this right-wing coalition, leaving the government. So now the government didn't have the majority, and then the Labour Party, the Social Democrats, decided to change. So they changed their position and went against on their National Assembly in the spring 2021. And since then, the debate has been not so much about, okay, these are the research reports, and can we say this about increased or decreased drug use or whatever. Now it's more like a human rights issue, because in the process, people shared personal stories. It was discovered, massive systematic violations on drug users' rights, where the police have been using coercive measures that actually were not legal. And so there has been a lot of these things. So this is the debate now. It's much harder, I would say. It's been quite polarized. And in some sense, it's still little. But what we are focusing on now is to trying to get this cross-partisan agreement, but it only goes to show that you need to actually have the broad masses on board. So this is the direction we are working in right now. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Kenneth. That's the Norway example is a really interesting one with certainly lots of lessons for other jurisdictions for sure. Can I ask Peter next?
Thanks, David. And yeah, I'd just like to thank SDF and Ana Liffey and Katy for reaching out and getting on board. And how amazing, you know, like it's all running on time, you know, and like the webinar's going on time and stuff. So good job. So yeah, my name's Peter Crycan. I work for the charity Cranston. We are a frontline delivery organisation, so delivering drug treatment services in the UK. But one of the proud things about working for a charity like Cranston while delivering frontline treatment services is also our campaigning side of things, and we campaign for the abolition of the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, with it being completely, in my opinion, unfit for purpose. You know, drugs have changed, drugs are very different, and I suppose I am most well known and here to talk about as Katy mentioned previously, the unsanctioned overdose prevention centre that I set up in Glasgow and ran for about 10 months. I suppose the reason for doing that was looking at within the current frameworks to try and push forward if we could actually operate within the current frameworks. Glasgow, the Scottish Government, Health and Social Care Partnership, etc., had all been in agreement that these facilities were something that could benefit people who were publicly injecting drugs in Glasgow. The estimates of hundreds of people still to this day publicly injecting drugs in Glasgow. I don't know if Kirsten's on this call, but you know, the whole thing about drug consumption rooms and overdose prevention centres and all that sort of stuff. I think when I look back now, you know, some of the differences in terms of how I would have campaigned around it and what I've learned since getting, because I only really got involved in this type of work, you know, when I said I was going to actually go out and do it and learned about harm reduction, is that, you know, in terms of these facilities and what I've seen in these facilities and what I've heard from other people, we often get these strap lines about, you know, nobody's ever died in an overdose prevention centre, whereas we know that that's not the actual reality. And the reason that these facilities were originally spoken about in Glasgow was because of the HIV outbreak. At the time, Glasgow was going through that period of HIV transmission between people who were homeless and injecting drugs, and it was to try and get on top of that rather than directly saving people's lives. But obviously the add-on impact, if somebody does have an overdose, the chances are that you will be able to keep them alive within these facilities. So yeah, and that's where I'm at now with it, is I love being on these types of things. I love talking about, you know, incremental movements forward. However, I think we are selling ourselves short when we talk about decriminalisation. And, you know, some of the things I've learned that I wouldn't do again is I wouldn't talk about this as a health response rather than a criminal justice response, because for most people who use drugs, it should neither be a health issue or a criminalisation issue. And I think that's the key aspect of it. And in my opinion, as a person who uses drugs. So I hope that's sort of explained my take a little bit and what I've done previously, and looking forward to the rest of the webinar. Thanks,
Peter. Can I ask now Anna Quigley, last but not least, our Irish representative. Thanks, Anna.
Thanks, Dave. That was awful to be last, because you can say, how do you follow all that? But anyway, I'll do my best. I mean, Citywide were in existence since 1995. And I suppose, interestingly enough, when we began as an organisation, we actually as an organisation believed in and advocated for tough laws against drugs, which seems strange now. And I suppose what's interesting is that you know, our radical shift in views has been very much based on experience, which in some ways makes it really, really solid and sound. It's grassroots experience. It's not something we've learned from anybody else or learned from books. We've learned it from our own experience. And I suppose central to that, in a way, from the very beginning, we had a very strong focus as an organisation on the link between you know, the problem drug use and basically economics, the poverty disadvantage. You'd be generally referred to as class issues in other countries, but we don't use that word in Ireland. And because of that analysis we had, I suppose that played a huge role in shifting our position, because we began to see a lot of the things that we saw as harms of drug use and the drugs trade and things that were causing so many difficulties and so much pain in our communities, we began to see are actually as a result of poverty and inequality and injustice. And we also began to realize, as part of that analysis, that the very policies that were being implemented to address the drugs issue, a lot of which we initially supported, were actually making the harms worse. And in particular, because it's still the reality, as people know, that there's a very strong link between criminalisation and poverty. We all know that communities that are poor are more criminalised. So it's compounding the difficulties. So that kind of learning process is central. And I think, as I say, it's given a very strong base to our approach, because, as I say, it's very much we've learned it ourselves the hard way, if you like. So we did our first, I suppose, that was our internal, where we within our own networks, we kind of developed our views. And around 2013, we did our first kind of seminar, which was taking it out to a broader audience to try and work with our statutory partners, political people, to get the message based on our experience out to a broader audience. What was really interesting was at that stage we connected up with Niamh Eastwood, actually, in Release, who was brilliant, and we were very relieved to discover when we went to look at the international evidence that it actually supported what we had figured out for ourselves. So that was a good thing to find. And following on that, 2014, we did some more work politically, just trying to get the message out. We did a kind of frequently asked questions leaflet, which was for the general public, because already at that stage, the confusion about what do we mean by decriminalisation had already become a very big issue. And we were trying to sort of make those messages sort of, easier to understand for people out in the general public who were getting confused. And basically get them to see we're talking about people and what was happening to people. I suppose we went through, we continued for a few years just to do that kind of lobbying with politicians, with getting messages out into the public and stuff. And really for a little while, I think it kind of felt like it was going nowhere and we weren't getting anywhere. But it's one of the things you've learned, even in the times when you feel nobody's listening or you're getting nowhere, it's worth keeping at it. And we kept at it because we knew what we were saying was true, because people were living it. And one of the things because we were sending out the information to the politicians all the time, as he described himself later, he was a backbencher, someone who was not in government, who was looking for issues, and he had seen one of our leaflets and he contacted us to get a better briefing around the issue of decriminalisation. And as luck would happen, then in 2016, that individual politician became the minister with responsibility for drugs. So it's like that you never do know. We just kept at the work, because you never do know when it's going to, when things are going to change and there's going to be broader political support. And obviously, again, that was around 2016, 2017. The minister, there was a really significant amount of progress. It was a short enough period he was in office, but I think, and again, it's some of the things you learned after he left office after an election, it felt for quite a while like things had stalled and stopped and even going backwards. But you begin to realize later you never really go backwards, because once you've had someone in a senior political level saying these things, saying we should not be criminalising, once they've been said publicly and once they've been accepted, because at that stage it was accepted generally by the establishment because it was a minister saying it, you never really go back. It mightn't be such a priority anymore, but you've kind of established, I suppose, that it's all right, it's possible to take these positions and talk about them. So again, it's back to that same thing of keeping at it. We went through another few years then in more recent years of feeling like we were getting nowhere. With our new strategy in 2017, there was a working group set up again to look at the issue of alternatives to criminalisation for possession, and the report it issued was massively disappointing. That felt like a real step backwards. But again, we still, you just keep on doing the lobbying and the campaigning, because you know that what you are saying is accurate. You can back it up. And again, as time goes on, and as Tony has said it there, I suppose we are now at a point where we are feeling a bit more optimistic in Ireland, because we can see our own politicians, we can see are seeing it on the ground. around that. They can see the drugs issue is affecting every community across the country. The politicians know that. So because I suppose over time we have kept in contact with them, they kind of do know about us, and they kind of feel, okay, well, maybe you can help now because you kind of know about this issue. So again, it's back to that message of regardless how unreceptive the systems might seem at any given time, you just keep doing it anyway, because at some point, the message gets through. Yeah, so at the moment, as I say, we're starting off the citizens' assembly process. Again, that was, I suppose, it happened as a result of we have Green Party as a member of our government coalition, and they got that put into the programme for government, which was massive. They were only a tiny part of the government, smallest party, but they got that put in there, and that meant that it gave the opportunity to make sure that happened. But it would be fair to say too, there is a very significant consensus now across our politics, across parties, that what we are doing now is not working, and even getting that consensus is really crucial, because there's a general agreement now what we're doing isn't working, and that means there's an openness now to kind of looking at the kind of change we need. So yeah, just as it stands now, we'd be feeling, I think, more positive, a realistic kind of positive, I suppose, because, none of these things are predictable. But the Citizens' Assembly is a big opportunity, because generally what they're about is recognising things aren't working and we need to change.
Okay.
Yeah.
So thanks, Anna. Just both Anna and myself sit on the European Civil Society Forum on Drugs for our sins, I would say. But one of the things from that, struck me very strongly was that there are two almost separate drivers around decriminalisation. One is the recreational users, and the other is the people with problems. Anna, you've described how your focus and the drive is around problematic drug use. What's your sense of drivers around recreational drug use and what you might call as criminalisation of a broader population of young people?
Yeah, well, I think the point we'd make there, Dave, is that what's most obvious is the negative impacts in the poorest areas, because the impact of our current policies are so stark in the areas, a lot of the areas we work in. They're visible. It's not just in the individuals, but in and their families. It's in the environment. It's in the activities that are happening in the areas. It's in the economic decline. It's in the housing. It's in you've got a crisis here in public housing, but areas that people won't go and live in. So it's very, very visible. In areas, a lot of recreational drug use, it's not causing problems. So you don't have that visibility. But what we can clearly say is that the kind of the public view of drugs and drug use in this country is very much framed by problem drug use. So it's a very negative picture. The stigma and the discrimination and the blame and the shame that apply to people in disadvantaged areas, that also extends to everybody who uses drugs. So we can clearly say that it isn't the current policy is to nobody's disadvantage. It impacts first, yes, on the poor.
Thanks, Anna.
Everybody.
Yeah. It was more the question around the sort of drivers of change, and can I ask Courtney? Can I ask you the same question around the aspects around recreational drug use, and is the drivers that you've used around problematic drug use?
Yeah, so here in Maine, we've mostly used, and this is something that we continue to grapple with, is how do we move the conversation just from problematic drug use to a wider and broader autonomy conversation. I personally believe that drugs should be decriminalized because I believe that I have the right to choose what happens to my body. And I personally choose not to use drugs because it's been problematic in my own personal life. But here in Maine, a lot of the conversations that have been particularly successful is around problematic drug use and how we help save lives. Like we try to keep our campaigns very broad, very high level, top level campaigns around how do we save lives, and we are trying to save lives. And if you aren't trying to save lives, then you're killing people, right? So And I was thinking like about some of the conversations that are happening here is, while we were not successful in our attempt to decriminalize personal possession during the first half of our legislative session, that campaign has been going on for multiple years and will continue to go on for multiple years after this. But it's also happening at the context and the nexus of many other harm reduction and recovery policy campaigns and debates. And one of the campaigns that we ran directly after the decriminalization campaign and built on it was our campaign to expand the Good Samaritan law. So in Maine, the Good Samaritan law protects people at the scene of an overdose. We had a law passed in 2019 that was very limited. And so we launched a campaign on the heels of the decriminalization campaign to expand the Good Samaritan law to protect anybody who is rendering aid at the scene, as well as the person who is overdosing, from being charged with most nonviolent crimes, including all drug crimes and all forms of community supervision violations and all warrants for arrest. And we were actually successful in passing the strongest Good Samaritan law in the entire United States. And that campaign was really built on this idea that if you want to save lives, we have to stop criminalizing people who use drugs. And if you want people to call 911, you can't charge them with trafficking. And we fought the governor all the way to her desk. She was adamantly opposed from day one until it hit her desk. And the only way that we got her we ended up with her signing the piece of legislation. And why that's important is because our governor is a cop. She grew up, she's a cop. She's not literally a cop, but she is. She had to sign the piece of legislation because she had also run on this idea that she was recovery friendly, right? She had run as my ally, as a person in recovery. She had said that she was going to help my community, and we held her feet to the fire all the way to the signing of the campaign, all the way to the point now that when she was running, she said she passed the Good Samaritan law. So whatever, if she wants to pass the Good Samaritan law, that's great. And now she's going to have to help us defend it. So.
Okay. Yeah, that's a really good example. Thanks. Magda.
Maybe I'll start actually with explaining a little bit what the legal situation in Poland is, because you're talking about decriminalization here. And unfortunately, I don't see Poland being too close to decrim these days. In contrary, I believe we've got the drug policy that is one of the most restrictive in Europe, because the drug use is not criminalized, but possession is, even of the smallest amounts. And it is punishable even with jail, even if, with imprisonment for up to 3 years. And what happened a bit more than a decade ago was the amendment to that law, a tiny amendment, a tiny change that was a huge success for us. Because while it does not withdraw criminalization, it provides a very useful tool for prosecutors and judges to actually dismiss the case, to stop the proceedings at the very early stage if the amount possessed was small, it was for personal use, and therefore the social harm caused by that deed is not huge. So we thought that would be actually the way to introduce de facto decriminalization in Poland, because the vast majority of drug-related offenses are simple possession offenses, no non-violent, no selling, just possessing in one's pocket. And then again, the vast majority of those that are for simple possession are really for possession of a joint of 1-2 grams of marijuana, of cannabis. Therefore, the hope was that actually most of the people who get in front of the prosecutor or in front of the judge would actually be released with no consequences. Up until today, the uptake of that law has been quite poor. This is how we judge that. 10 years after the introduction of that law, in around 30% of the cases in front of the prosecutors are dismissed using that article. This is the Article 62A. And when it comes to the courts, it's just in 1% of the cases. So still 10 years ago, we thought that was a big success and the shift. There was a lot of work and attention, a lot of effort put towards working with the media in different ways, different levels to educate them about this complex issue of drug policy, to educate about the language that might be stigmatizing, how they may want to cover the issues, etc. So it was about education, it was about networking with journalists, it was also about trying to make drug policy an attractive topic to them. So organizing like competences for media makers where they could submit their pieces, trying to find opportunities if funds are available to allow them to travel to the countries that have decriminalization so they can see themselves how it may work, arranging them to participate in international events where they can meet experts, talk to people with lived experience, etc., etc. And I believe that paid off. As I said, the law was changed a bit more than 10 years ago, 11 almost. But then the uptake was very limited at the very beginning. As I said, it's not great even today, but at the very beginning it was even lower. So civil societies organizations, mainly the Foundation Drug Policy Network, Polish Drug Policy Network, which was already mentioned today at the slides, they initiated a series of trainings for prosecutors and judges, where they invited also lawyers from the Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights, where they invited therapists, people with lived experience, as I said, as speakers, as trainers. And the idea was to basically introduce that change of the law to prosecutors and judges, because it turned out that not necessarily they were aware of that, to make them understand the idea behind. At that time, it was a slogan that is better to treat people rather than to punish them. Today, we would say support rather than punish, not necessarily treat everyone, but at that time, it was a useful argument. So the idea was to basically sensitize them to that type of thinking. The trainings were evaluated as useful by participants. I believe they were useful also for the organizers. It was also a chance to discover why prosecutors and judges do not use that article that often. We heard, and until today, we keep hearing that it is a challenge for prosecutors to decide what is a small amount, what isn't. How to decide what was for personal use, what wasn't. So it is still an ongoing conversation.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Magda. Yeah. I mean, I think it highlights the notion of the incremental change, doesn't it? And sometimes the change, happens through the legislation, but then it doesn't actually impact. I mean, we have the same potential issue in the Scottish context of recorded warnings. We don't know, because that's delegated to the police. We don't actually know how many have been actually given to people in possession of drugs other than the Class C drugs. Can I bring Katy in? Sorry, Katy, I meant to bring you in a bit earlier, but do you want to, there's a whole load of questions come in. I don't know if you want to sum those up into probably one final question to the panel, because we've only got 10 minutes left, sadly. I know we could have gone on an awful lot longer than that. Katy.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm trying my best to shoehorn lots of the themes into one, but actually it does come out as a couple of different things. So I guess the mainstay of what people is asking is, how do we get like that consensus and terminology and framing, taking account of all the sort of issues about the wide range of people that use drugs, including people that experience addiction, as well as people who may not, and who are the most important stakeholders to target in terms of getting change. And also just how we prevent backsliding. So with changes and progress that has been made, how do we sort of keep that and move forward with further reform? So those are the sort of key themes. Okay, the consensus and allies in terms of moving things forward. Yeah. Peter, can I bring you back in first of all?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's going to be one of the key themes. How do we get consensus? How do we move forward? I think, and certainly from my perspective in a Scottish and UK context, you know, I look to other parts of the world, you know, like places like Canada, you know, and places in Europe where we have active drug user networks, like the Drug User Liberation Front, who have, you know, done some fantastic work by purchasing their own drugs and being able to test those drugs and distribute them through their communities. Vandu, who have done some excellent campaigning work, the European Network of People Who Use Drugs, the International Network of People Who Use Drugs, but we, I think, have failed to bring that forward since, you know, becoming the, you know, since we led the way in harm reduction and you know, born out of Liverpool, and, you know, and then, you know, the 71 Act, and you know, let's, in my opinion, the, you know, the war on drugs is you know, a tool, has been used as a tool to oppress Black, Brown, Latinx, Hispanic communities, you know, and we've pulled that into other areas around the world, you know. And actually, I organised a conference last week, and Dr. Carol Hart was our closing speaker, and he talked about how we needed to resist incrementalisation, so incremental change, you know, and to move that forward. I think what we do need to do is we need to stop asking for the crumbs at the table. You know, we need to stop asking for the crumbs at the table. We need to approach our governments and our decision makers and force, and we need to change our language within these meetings as well. You know, and we need to talk about no longer about a drugs issue, but a drugs policy issue. You know, for the vast majority of people who use drugs, they're not problematic, and most of the problems that are actually created for many people are created through our current systems, our systems of oppression and criminalisation, you know, and brutality towards people who use drugs, locking people up who use drugs. It's bodily autonomy, and we need to recognise that. It's my bodily autonomy to be able to do that. And I think what I'll finish, because I know we're really short on time, but in my opinion, a lot of our inability to move this forward comes from our inability to be honest and step up within our current systems. Because if you put your head above the parapet and you say that you're a drug user, especially when it comes to the drugs that have been sensationalized, that's going to potentially still affect your personal relationships, your work, you know, and potentially criminalisation as well. So how do we start those networks? I know SDF have tried, and you know, there was movements, and then COVID hit. So I think that's something that we need to actively look to do again.
Peter. Yeah, certainly, you know, we're working on those active user groups, and it's a fair point in the Scottish context that we don't, you know, we haven't had that. And I'll maybe bring Kenneth back in here in terms of the importance of you know, user activists as part of the decriminalisation debate. Kenneth.
Yeah, I think for our part, we have been both a blessing and tormenting, I would say. I think it has been important with people with lived experiences, especially in terms of explaining, conveying how the stigmatizing effects of the war on drugs and the language that's being used and the measures that are being used, how it affects people and how it affects them and their families, and how it makes them struggle to ask for help when there is need for help, and how they start viewing themselves, you know, internalizing the way society view them. So I think at least what we learned from the process in Norway is that having this debate has mobilized groups of people that previously didn't really have a voice. And that also, I think, made the debate much more interesting, where it was, as Peter was saying, you know, we stopped asking for crumbs, you know, we're sitting down at the table. We also, when there was a chance of losing, you know, the reform, there were discussions about maybe making some compromises to make things a little bit easier, but we were like, absolutely no, here is the line in the sand. And this is a human rights issue, and we demand our rights being respected. And I think this was it's been important, you know, for the self-esteem of people. We are no longer seen as losers in society. You know, people tend to view us differently, and this has made our voice much stronger to demand changes in the future, you know, broader than what was originally proposed with this decriminalization reform. For instance, we have seen changes in terms of what the police now are allowed to do against us. It has been, as I said, disclosed, you know, that they have been systematically abusing coercive measures against our people, and now the general prosecutors have put an end to this, and there has been decisions in the Supreme Court. So I think this very polarized debate has kept a lot of people enthusiastic about the theme, and this, I think, actually have made bigger changes than we would get only for decriminalization. So I think the users' voices have been very important, Jeff.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kenneth. We're nearly out of time, so I'm going to give Courtney, as our participant from the furthest away, the last word. Courtney.
Yeah, I'll make it super short. I just wanted to say that I absolutely 100% agree with Kenneth and Peter, and that our community, our activist community across the world, needs to draw our line in the sand and say that this is what we need for our people, this is what we need for our communities, and this is what we're going to have. And every time that I've seen activist communities do that, we get there. And I truly believe that across the entire world, we can take care of our communities because we've been doing it for decades.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Courtney, so much. And that's a really important point to end on. Clearly, we could have gone on an awful lot longer in terms of this discussion and debate, but we've come to the end of the webinar. So finally, I'd like to thank you all for attending, and a special thanks to today's presenters, the panelists, and Tony Duffin and the Ana Liffey Project. I think you'll agree it's been a thought-provoking and interesting session, and provided important insights into how we might progress decriminalisation, or however we describe it, across various jurisdictions. So thanks again, and goodbye for now, and thanks for joining. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.